She hugged the wrong man at the airport and never imagined he was a millionaire. Before we start, comment below where you are watching from. I love knowing how far these stories can reach. And if you love love stories, make sure to subscribe to the channel. That way, you help the channel grow and we can keep bringing you more and more moving stories. The Atlanta airport terminal was filled with the frantic movement of passengers, hurriedly sliding suitcases and impersonal announcements echoing through the vast and cold space. Samantha Collins, a 27-year-old woman with fair skin, lightly sprinkled with freckles that further highlighted her intense green eyes, was slowly walking through the crowd. Her wavy red hair, shoulder length, was tied up in a messy bun, yet a few strands escaped and framed her delicate face. She wore a simple denim jacket over a white t-shirt and black pants, typical of someone who prioritizes comfort when traveling. But even unintentionally, she exuded a natural beauty that caught people's attention. She clutched her phone to her chest, her eyes still moist. Moments earlier, she had said goodbye to her sister, who had left for a new life in California. "Take care, and don't forget to text me when you arrive," she had asked through tears. Now she wandered through the terminal, trying to hold back the emotion that insisted on escaping, suffocated by that hurried environment, indifferent to what she was feeling. Then, looking ahead, she spotted a tall man standing with his back turned, wearing a brown leather jacket, very similar to the one her brother-in-law usually wore. He was standing still, distracted, looking at the flight, bored with a carry-on by his side. Without thinking, driven by a desperate impulse for comfort, Samantha quickened her pace and, in an instinctive gesture, hugged him from behind, holding him tightly and burying her face into the warm fabric of the jacket. "I can't take any more goodbyes. Please promise me you'll take care of her," she whispered with a choked voice, still unaware of her mistake. The man stood motionless for a second, surprised by that unexpected contact. Slowly, he turned to face her. Samantha abruptly stepped back as soon as she realized it wasn't who she thought. Standing before her was Alexander Morgan, a 35-year-old man with light olive skin, slightly wavy dark brown hair falling impeccably over his forehead. He had a scruffy beard and bluish-gray eyes that at first seemed cold, but at that moment reflected something else. An unexpected tenderness. She widened her eyes, bringing her hand to her mouth, completely embarrassed. "I'm sorry. Oh my God, I thought you were someone else," she said, taking a step back, her face flushed. Alexander, with a slight half-smile, raised an eyebrow and replied calmly, "Don't worry." It was the most sincere hug I've received in years. Samantha felt a tightness in her chest, unsure of how to react. The man seemed completely at ease, even in the face of her monumental blunder. "Really? I'm sorry. That was so inappropriate," she muttered, already starting to turn to leave. But before she could go, Alexander, on an impulse, gently held her wrist. "Are you okay?" he asked with a deep voice, yet filled with concern. Samantha hesitated, taking a deep breath, not having the courage to look directly into his eyes. Just a rough day." Alexander released her wrist delicately and in an almost confessional tone murmured, "Sometimes a rough day can change our whole life." She looked at him for a brief second as if those words had pierced through her emotional armor, but then she looked away and hurried off, disappearing into the crowd. Alexander stood there watching her disappear, feeling that strange tightness in his chest. He didn't know who she was, but for the first time in years, he felt that someone had crossed through his defenses with a simple hug. Meanwhile, Samantha was walking quickly, her heart racing and her mind confused. How embarrassing! How crazy! She kept repeating to herself, unable to get the image of that unknown man out of her mind, someone who, somehow, had comforted her without even knowing it. And although neither of them could have imagined that improbable encounter would be just the first chapter of a story capable of forever transforming the course of their lives. Samantha walked hurriedly through the airport terminal, her heart still pounding and her face burning with embarrassment. The scene of the hug wouldn't leave. Her mind, the texture of the jacket, the unexpected warmth of that unknown body, and most of all, that look. Why did he say that, she thought, biting her lower lip while clutching her passport to her chest. Turning the corner to take the train to the parking lot, she impulsively looked over her shoulder as if searching for confirmation that that moment had really happened. And then she saw him. Alexander remained standing in the same place, his suitcase beside him, his hands in the pockets of his tailored pants, and his eyes fixed on her, as if the world around them had lost all sound and color. She stopped in her tracks without realizing it. He took 2 steps toward her, calm, unhurried, but with a confidence that made the ground feel steady, even though both of them were suspended in an invisible atmosphere of tension and expectation. Samantha felt her throat go dry, as if the crowd moving around them no longer existed. When Alexander stopped in front of her, he extended his hand, not intruding into her space, just offering a chance to stay, to pause in the midst of that chaos. She, not really understanding what she was doing, accepted the touch. Their fingers intertwined almost automatically, warm, firm, and at the same time gentle, as if that handshake sealed something neither of them could name. He tilted his head slightly, and in a deep, yet tender, tone said, "That was the most sincere hug I've received in years." The words washed over Samantha like a silent wave, leaving her breathless for a moment. She swallowed hard, letting out a nervous half-smile as she replied in a faint voice, "Sorry, I thought you were someone else." Alexander let out a brief laugh, a low and sincere sound, as if he wasn't bothered at all by the misunderstanding. "I know, but either way, thank you." Samantha didn't know what to say. She just stood there, looking at that man who in a few seconds had stirred more within her than many people had in years. Then the loudspeaker announced the final boarding call for the flight to New York. Alexander briefly glanced at the screen, and then returned his eyes to her with an expression that seemed to say, "I have to go, but I wish I could stay." Samantha slowly let go of his hand, like someone waking up from a good dream, and with a restrained smile, turned to go her own way. He stood still, watching her leave, as if he wanted to memorize every detail of that red-haired woman who had unexpectedly invaded his routine with a simple gesture and, without knowing it, awakened in him a long-forgotten desire. The desire to truly connect. As Samantha disappeared between the metal and glass columns of the airport, Alexander let out a silent sigh, grabbed his suitcase, and walked toward the boarding gate, but with a fixed thought. Who was she? And why can't I get that hug out of my head? On the other side, inside the train taking her to the parking lot, Samantha rested her head against the window and closed her eyes, letting a solitary tear escape. That was crazy, she whispered to herself, unable to explain why. Even on that morning filled with goodbyes, that stranger had left such a deep mark, and without her knowing, that man she had hugged by mistake was one of the most powerful businessmen in the country. But fate, as capricious as always, had already decided that would not be the last encounter, only the first. In the days that followed, Alexander couldn't get the image of that unknown woman out of his mind. He mentally replayed the hug, the involuntary touch of their hands, the startled and yet so sincere expression. Amid important meetings, phone calls, and contracts, it was that moment that insisted on occupying the space that used to belong only to business. On the afternoon of a grey Thursday, after wrapping up a quick visit to one of his hotels in Atlanta, he decided he needed some time away from the ostentation that always surrounded him. He took a regular car, dismissed his security detail and went walking through the streets of Midtown with no set destination, just following the flow of people. Turning the corner of a tree-lined street, he spotted a small cafe with faded red awnings and a hand-painted wooden sign, Bean and Soul. The strong aroma of freshly brewed coffee escaped through the slightly open door, mixed with the soft sound of jazz coming from an old record player. Without thinking much, he went. Inside, the atmosphere was cozy, with a few rustic wooden tables, warm lighting, and framed motivational quotes casually hanging on the walls. Behind the counter, with her back turned, a woman was organizing cups, distracted. Alexander's heart quickened without explanation. When she turned around, holding a tray of cakes, he held his breath. It was her, Samantha, with her red hair now loose, wore a beige apron over her white t-shirt and jeans. The freckles were more visible under the soft light, and her green eyes sparkled, surprised as she recognized him. For a second, they stood there, motionless, just staring at each other, as if time had once again stopped around them. Alexander gave a discreet smile. Samantha bit the corner of her lip, an involuntary gesture that revealed her nervousness. "You," she murmured, more to herself than to him. He walked over to the counter, rested his hands on the polished wood, and with the same deep and calm voice said, "I think you owe me a coffee, or maybe I owe you one." She let out a muffled laugh, surprised by the coincidence, or was it fate, and gestured for him to sit at one of the tables near the window. "Have a seat. I'll be right with you," she said, while trying to steady her breathing, still dazed by his presence there. Alexander sat down, folded his hands on the table, and watched her discreetly, noticing how she moved gracefully, even while carrying heavy trays, like someone who was used to balancing more than just plates, perhaps emotions, perhaps responsibilities. Samantha approached, holding a notepad in her hand, but then set it aside. "Let me guess. A strong espresso?" she joked, smiling. Though her eyes still carried a hint of curiosity, Alexander nodded. "How do you know?" "I don't. You just seem like the type who doesn't like sugar," she replied, already turning to prepare the drink. As the coffee brewed, she glanced discreetly over at the shelf of cakes, and suddenly the tray slipped from her hands, dropping a slice of cheesecake onto the floor. "Darn!" she muttered, quickly squatting down. Alexander instinctively stood up and helped her pick up the plate, their fingers involuntarily touching once again. "It seems like we always meet like this, a bit clumsy," he commented, drawing a shy laugh from her. "Yeah, it does seem that way," she replied, standing up and adjusting her apron, trying to hide the blush on her cheeks. She then served the coffee and asked, "Just this, or would you like something to eat? Though I'm terrible with cakes today." Alexander let out a sincere laugh, a rare sound in his typically controlled and cold routine. "Just the coffee, and if I may, your company." Samantha slightly widened her eyes, surprised by the direct invitation. "My company?" she repeated, looking around. "Yes, if you can." "Of course." She hesitated, glanced at her co-worker at the register, who gave her an approving nod and then pulled out the chair in front of him. "Why not?" she replied, sitting down, still half in disbelief at what was happening. And so, surrounded by the aroma of coffee, the soft music, and the afternoon falling outside, they began to talk. They spoke about simple things: the best places in Atlanta, movies they hated, books they never finished reading. Then they talked about fears, about how much goodbyes hurt, and how sometimes an unexpected hug can say more than 1,000 words. Alexander listened more than he spoke, enchanted by the way Samantha talked about life, without realizing how beautiful she was, how her simplicity made her unique. She, in turn, found it strange how that man, so elegant, seemed so comfortable in that simple cafe, so interested in hearing every little detail of her routine. As time passed, they didn't even notice how the hours had flown by. Samantha looked at the clock on her phone and widened her eyes. "Oh my God, it's almost 7!" Alexander smiled with that look that seemed to see right through her. "So, can I see you again?" he asked, with the naturalness of someone not used to hearing a no. She remained silent for a second, looking at the empty coffee cup as if weighing reason against her heart. "Maybe," she replied, standing up and adjusting her apron. He smiled, satisfied with the ambiguity of the answer, as she walked back to the counter, her heart racing, not knowing that she had just taken the first step towards something much bigger than she could ever imagine. And Alexander, as he left the cafe that afternoon, was sure of one thing: that encounter wasn't a coincidence. It was a sign. In the days that followed, Samantha and Alexander exchanged a few short messages, arranging another meeting. She, still suspicious of that improbable coincidence, she tried to resist the idea of getting closer, but something about him pulled her with a force she couldn't explain. That night, he invited her for a different kind of outing. He wanted to show her a side of Atlanta that few tourists knew, but that held meaning for him. Centennial Olympic Park at night, magically lit, with lights reflecting in the water and creating the perfect setting for any story, or for any beginning. Samantha agreed. When he picked her up, she wore a simple navy blue dress with a denim jacket over it, her red hair tied back in a low bun, with a few loose strands dancing in the gentle breeze. Alexander, in a white shirt, with the sleeves rolled up and dark pants, looked even more elegant in his simplicity. "You look beautiful," he said as soon as she got in the car. Samantha smiled, a little shy, and replied while looking out the window, "Do you say that to all the girls you take out?" He let out a quiet laugh. "Only to the ones who give me unexpected hugs." She glanced sideways at him and laughed, already relaxing a little more. They walked through the park, among tall trees and paths lit by old-fashioned lampposts. The sound of the central fountain blended with the laughter of couples and families, also enjoying that mild spring evening. They stopped in front of the dancing water fountain, where synchronized jets rose and fell to the rhythm of soft instrumental music. Samantha crossed her arms, taking a deep breath, as if trying to absorb the beauty of the scene to keep in her memory. "I used to come here when I was a kid," Alexander said, breaking the silence. "My mom used to bring me to see the lights." Samantha looked at him surprised. It was the first time he said something personal. "Does she still live here?" Alexander stayed silent for a few seconds, staring at the water reflecting the night sky. "No. She passed away a few years ago." Samantha felt a pang in her chest. Without thinking, she gently touched his arm. "I'm sorry." Alexander turned to her with a serene smile, but his eyes revealed a deep sadness. "It's okay. Those things shape us, right?" She nodded. "Yeah, sometimes more than we'd like." And as if that moment of vulnerability had opened a new door between them, they started talking about their insecurities, their fears hidden beneath seemingly normal routines. Alexander confessed his exhaustion from a life surrounded by interests and appearances, while Samantha revealed her fear of never being enough, of spending her whole life fighting to survive without ever really living. "I always thought I had to be strong all the time," she said, looking down at the stones. Wet from the fountain, Alexander then stepped closer, so near that Samantha could feel his breath. "You are strong," he said firmly. "But you can be vulnerable too. That doesn't make you weak." Samantha slowly lifted her eyes, meeting his, so intense and sincere that for a moment she forgot to breathe. Then Alexander raised his hand, delicately touching her face. His fingers tracing the line of her jaw, moving up to brush aside a loose strand of red hair falling over her eyes. She stood still, her heart beating so loudly it seemed to echo through the quiet park. And then he kissed her. Slowly, like someone afraid of breaking something too fragile, with tenderness, but at the same time with a contained passion. stifled by years of emotional self-defense. Samantha responded, hesitant at first, then surrendering to the moment, forgetting about the park, the lights, everything except that kiss, that paradoxically felt like both a beginning and an end. When they pulled apart, still close, she took a deep breath, confused, and murmured, "This shouldn't be happening." Alexander smiled, keeping his hand on her face, and replied without hesitation, "Then why does it feel so right?" Samantha stared at him for a few seconds, unsure of what to say. Then, as if afraid of completely losing herself, she took a step back and looked away. I need to go," she said, already starting to walk away. Alexander didn't try to stop her. He just stood there, watching her hurry down the lit path until her silhouette disappeared among the trees. He let out a long sigh, running a hand through his hair and looking again at the fountain as the water kept dancing indifferently, as if nothing had happened. But he knew, that night, that kiss had changed everything, and even though she had walked away, Alexander was certain that story was just beginning. In the days that followed that night at the park, Samantha tried to convince herself that it had been just a moment, an impulse, something that should be forgotten. But her heart insisted on reminding her, in every detail, the gentle touch on her face, the warmth of the kiss, and above all, that question that still echoed in her mind. Then, why does it feel so right? She started walking more slowly, to work, hoping, without admitting it, that he would show up at any moment just like the first time. And he did. Alexander, on the other hand, could no longer keep his distance. Always so used to controlling everything, he felt vulnerable in front of that woman who had no idea who he was, and precisely because of that, treated him so differently from the other people in his life. They began meeting almost without realizing that it had become a habit. Samantha would close the cafe, and he was already outside, waiting for her with that discreet smile, his hands in the pockets of his leather jacket, always with the same serene demeanor, but with eyes filled with silent intentions. One of those nights, they walked along the Beltline, an old railway converted into an urban trail, surrounded by colorful graffiti and small alternative shops. The air was fresh, and yet Samantha shrank slightly when a cooler breeze passed. Without saying anything, Alexander took off his own jacket and placed it over her shoulders. "You're going to get cold," she protested, trying to give it back. "I'd rather that than see you uncomfortable," he replied, gently holding her wrists, stopping her from removing the jacket. Samantha lowered her eyes, feeling her heart race. She wanted to believe that it was just a gesture of chivalry, but more and more she realized that it was much more than that. As they walked side by side, she confessed in a low tone, almost as if afraid to give voice to her own thought. "Sometimes I wonder if I'm getting too involved." Alexander stopped, slowly turned to face her, saying nothing for a few seconds, as if waiting for her to continue. "It's just that you seem to have such a different life from mine, and I'm just a girl who works at a neighborhood cafe." He stepped closer, gently lifting her chin, forcing her to look at him. "You're not just anything," he said firmly, his eyes locked on hers. "You are the most real person I've met in a long time." Samantha bit her lip, holding back the urge to cry. She wanted to believe those words, but reason screamed that it couldn't work. What she didn't know was that Alexander was also fighting his own silent battle. Every time he looked at her, he felt the desire to reveal who he really was, to tell her that this simple man, who rode the subway and ate at diners with her, was actually one of the most powerful businessmen in the country, owner of a fortune that he no longer even knew if it represented him. But he couldn't. He wanted for the first time someone to love him for the man he was, not for what he owned. While she felt too small beside him, he felt too big, too heavy, as if the truth could crush everything they had built up to that point. Even so, they kept surrendering to that romance that grew without asking for permission. They went out for dinners at small hidden bistros, rode bicycles on Sundays in Piedmont Park, watched old movies at outdoor screenings, and between one laugh and another, there were stolen kisses outside the cafe before she went into work, in the middle of the trail when she stopped to admire a piece of graffiti, or on a park bench when the world seemed to stop just for them. But the closer they got, the greater Samantha's fear became. One of those nights, after a long kiss, in front of the building where she lived, she leaned her forehead against his chest and whispered, "I don't know if I can give myself to this." Alexander wrapped his arms around her, pulling her close. "You don't have to decide anything. Now just stay," he replied, with a voice so full of sincerity that she simply closed her eyes and took a deep breath, allowing herself to stay there a little longer. But when she entered her apartment, leaning against the door, she let out a long sigh, like someone who knows they are standing on the edge of an abyss, and outside, standing on the sidewalk, Alexander looked up at the lit window and murmured to himself, "How can I tell her and not lose her?" The fear was mutual, and while love silently blossomed like a plant growing through cracks in the pavement, both kept walking on unstable ground, not knowing that sooner or later the truth would come to light and change everything. That hot Saturday afternoon, Samantha was finishing cleaning one of the cafe tables when the television, always tuned to the local news, caught her attention with an urgent announcement. And now, breaking news. Businessman Alexander Morgan expands his luxury hotel chain to the West Coast, consolidating himself as one of the most powerful names in American hospitality. She instinctively turned to look, and at that exact moment, the image filled the screen. Alexander, impeccably dressed in a navy blue suit, standing alongside investors and celebrities, smiling before the cameras at a grand opening. For a second, Samantha froze, the tray slipping from her hands and hitting the floor with a dull crash. The cups shattered into pieces, but she didn't even notice. Her heart seemed to have stopped. It was him, the man who rode bicycles with her on Sundays, who lent her his jacket on cold nights, who kissed her tenderly as if there were no tomorrow. And there on the screen, he was someone else, a man she would never have known if not for a cruel twist of fate. "No, it can't be," she murmured, her breathing ragged, as if refusing to believe what she was seeing. Her co-worker ran over to her. "Sam, are you okay?" But Samantha didn't even hear. She walked closer to the television, as if that could change what her eyes were witnessing. The anchor continued. Alexander Morgan, CEO of Morgan Hotels, heir to one of the largest fortunes in the country, is known for his discretion. The words echoed like a brutal blow in her mind. Fortune, heir, discretion. Now everything made sense. The intense looks, the reserved manner, the silences. Samantha felt her stomach churn as if she had been deceived in the cruelest possible way. "He lied to me the whole time," she whispered, her voice breaking as she grabbed her bag and hurried out of the cafe, leaving her co-worker stunned. Hours later, already home, locked inside her small apartment, sitting on the floor, hugging her knees, she cried uncontrollably. Her phone kept vibrating, but she ignored it. She knew it was him. And then, the next morning, while serving a couple at the cafe, the bell above the door rang. Samantha looked up and saw Alexander enter, as if that place were the most natural for him. He wore a light grey shirt, with the sleeves rolled up, dark pants, and an anxious expression, like someone carrying the weight of silent guilt. She froze for a second, but quickly looked away, pretending not to notice, and continued taking the order. Alexander approached the counter and softly called out, "Sam, can we talk?" She took a deep breath, placed the pen on the notepad, and without even looking at him, coldly replied, "What more do you want, Alexander? Haven't you played enough?" He tried to touch her hand, but she pulled back, crossing her arms as if erecting an invisible wall. "Please, listen to me," he pleaded, his voice lower, desperate. Samantha then looked up, and for the first time, he saw not just hurt in her eyes, but also disdain and disbelief. "I thought you were someone simple," she said, her voice trembling but firm. "But you just wanted to play with me. You made me believe that we were equals, and it was all just an act." Alexander opened his mouth, trying to find the right words, but they simply didn't come. Samantha shook her head with a bitter half-smile and added, "I was such an idiot, wasn't I?" He, his eyes filled with tears, tried to argue, "Sam, it's not like that." But she interrupted, "No, not now. I need to work." She turned abruptly, going into the kitchen, leaving him there, standing, vulnerable, for the first time, not knowing what to do or say. Alexander stood for a few more seconds, staring at the empty counter, took a deep breath and left, carrying with him a heavy silence, like someone who had just lost something they didn't realize was so valuable until now. Samantha, behind the kitchen door, slid down to the floor and hugged her knees, letting the tears roll. Silently, and in that moment she knew her heart was broken, but her pride was intact. She just didn't realize that, even broken, that heart still had much to live alongside him, if only he knew how to rebuild it. The following days were a whirlwind of silence and absence. Samantha even avoided passing by the places where she used to meet Alexander. The cafe felt suffocating, the air heavier, as if every corner still held his scent, the quiet sound of his laughter, the warmth of kisses that now seemed so distant, almost imagined. But Alexander didn't give up. That night, he showed up again, not at the cafe, but in front of the simple building where Samantha lived, in the residential neighborhood of Grant Park, one of the oldest areas in Atlanta, full of houses with porches and century-old trees. He stood there, under the yellow glow of the street lamp, with a downcast expression, holding a small box with wildflowers he had personally chosen at one of the street markets he used to visit with her. When Samantha opened the door, wearing a worn-out sweatshirt and her hair tied up any which way, she froze, seeing him there. For a few seconds, only the cold wind filled the space between them. Alexander took a deep breath and with a hoarse voice said, "Please, just listen to me." Samantha crossed her arms, as if trying to protect herself, and coldly replied, "I have nothing else to hear." But he took a step forward, undeterred, and insisted, "I didn't want to deceive you. I never did. I just wanted you to see me as Alex, not as the Morgan in the papers." She laughed, but it was a bitter laugh, more like a trapped sob. "Congratulations, you succeeded. I saw, and I fell in love with a lie." Alexander closed his eyes, as if those words were knives driven into his chest. "It wasn't a lie, Sam. It was the only truth I wanted to live." She shook her head, outraged, taking a step back as if his proximity were toxic. "You had 1,000 chances to tell me. You preferred to let me believe that we were equals, that you were just a normal guy. You played with my trust." Alexander gripped the box of flowers more tightly, as if that could stop her words from cutting so deeply. "I didn't choose to fall in love. It just happened." The sincerity in his voice made Samantha hesitate for a second, but she quickly regained her composure, lifting her chin with a hardened look. "Well, I didn't choose it either, but it happened. And now, I don't know who you are anymore." Alexander extended his hand, almost pleading, "Give me a chance, just one." She looked at his hand, hesitated, and then closed the door gently, but firmly enough for him to understand there was no more space there. On the other side of the door, Samantha slid down to the floor, covering her face with her hands as the tears finally broke through the wall she had tried to build since the day she found out. Outside, Alexander stood motionless for a few seconds, staring at the cold wood before placing the box of flowers on the doorstep and walking slowly down the empty sidewalk, as if abandoning not just a place, but a hope. That very night, he boarded a flight back to New York. Sitting in the first-class seat, his gaze lost through the airplane window, Alexander felt the same emptiness that Samantha was experiencing in her small apartment. Two broken hearts, separated not by a lack of love, but by too much fear and the absence of truth. As the city slept, each of them, in different corners, cried in silence, wishing everything had been different, but not knowing how to fix it. The months dragged on as if time had lost its urgency for Samantha. The cafe, once full of small joys, now seemed like a colorless set. Every customer who walked in, every order written down, every cup washed, it all felt automatic, soulless. The nights were the worst. Lying on the small bed in her silent apartment, she stared at the ceiling and involuntarily replayed every detail. The walks holding hands through the city, the conversations by the lake, the warmth of his embrace on cold nights, the kiss at the park fountain. She closed her eyes tightly, as if trying to erase the memories, but memory always won. Why couldn't I trust? She murmured to herself, clutching the pillow to her chest. Despite the hurt, the wounded pride, there was a truth she could no longer deny. She had never felt so loved, so desired, so seen as she did when she was with Alexander. And that absence now occupied everything. In New York, Alexander was also fighting his own silent battle. In the luxurious glass-walled office at the top of one of the skyscrapers on Fifth Avenue, surrounded by rushed assistants, million-dollar contracts, and important decisions, he was there, but absent. The spark in his eyes had disappeared. The meetings he once led with a firm hand had become monotonous, cold. One late afternoon, while the city below pulsed in its frenetic rhythm, Alexander stood in front of the glass wall, looking at the horizon of buildings that seemed to have no end. In his hand, he slowly turned a small keychain engraved with the name of one of his hotels. The same hotel where months before he had planned to expand his business to Atlanta. The same one that had, unintentionally, led him to cross paths with Samantha. He let out a long sigh, closed his eyes, and whispered to himself, "What's the point of all this, if she's not here?" Days later, in an impulsive yet meaningful gesture, he made an unprecedented decision. He gathered the administrative team in an elegant meeting room with walls covered in dark wood and long glass panels. Everyone stared at him, attentive. Alexander took a deep breath and, with the same seriousness with which he closed deals, announced, "We're going to temporarily close Morgan Atlanta." A murmur of surprise spread through the room. One of the directors asked, "Mr. Morgan, but that hotel is one of the most profitable." He raised his hand, interrupting. "I need to reflect on my priorities." And without explaining anything else, he got up and left the room under the perplexed gaze of the executives. Hours later, alone in the presidential suite of one of his hotels, he threw his blazer over the chair, loosened his tie, and sat on the edge of the bed, staring into the void. He pushed away the phone that vibrated with messages and turned it off. At that moment, he didn't care about contracts, shares, or figures. He wanted peace, or maybe he wanted her. Meanwhile, Samantha, on the other side of the country, closed the cafe earlier that day. After turning off the lights and locking the door, she stood on the sidewalk, looking at the empty street. With her hands in the pockets of her jacket, she took a deep breath, as if carrying an invisible weight, and whispered to herself, "I wonder Does he still think about me? Both, separated by distance but still united by the longing that tightened their chests and the memory of what they had lived, kept fighting against themselves, unaware that that pause, that distance, was shaping each of them, preparing them for something they couldn't even foresee, and without knowing, fate was already moving. The days in New York had become unbearable for Alexander. The routine of meetings, business cocktail parties, helicopter trips, everything felt so empty. He could no longer bear to live away from Samantha without at least trying to fix what he had broken. On a cold morning, after a sleepless night, he made the decision he had postponed for months. He looked at himself in the mirror of the spacious, silent room and murmured to himself, "Enough, enough." Hours later, he was boarding a flight back to Atlanta, alone, without his team, without fanfare, just him, with a discreet suitcase and the silent hope that there was still something he could do. When he arrived in the city, he walked through the streets he knew so well by her side, with the strange sensation of being closer, and at the same time farther away than ever. He made his way to the Bean and Soul, the small cafe where it had all begun. The red awning was still there, worn by time, but as he approached, he noticed something strange. The doors were closed, the lights off, in the window a simple and cold sign, "For rent." He frowned, confused, knocked on the door a few times, but no one answered. Determined to find out what had happened, he sought out Samantha's former co-worker who, upon recognizing him, hesitated before speaking. But, seeing the sincerity in his expression, she gave in. She doesn't work here anymore," the young woman said regretfully. "She was fired a few months ago." Alexander widened his eyes, incredulous. "What do you mean? Why?" The co-worker took a deep breath, looking around before continuing. She reported the owner for harassment. She had evidence, but he fired her anyway, said she just wanted attention. The cafe didn't last much after that. Everyone left. Alexander remained silent, feeling a mixture of pride and pain. Samantha had shown the courage that so many others hadn't, but paid the price. "Do you know where she is now?" he asked urgently. The co-worker shrugged. "No one knows for sure. I think she's looking for another job. I heard she's doing some odd gigs." Alexander ran his hand through his hair, frustrated, and at the same time taken by a certainty. He couldn't just leave. Not now. That same week, discreetly, he contacted the property owners and bought the place. Not as Alexander Morgan, the billionaire, but as Alex, the man who wanted to turn that space, which had once been a setting of injustice, into a symbol of a new beginning. He renovated the interior, kept the rustic style, but removed the old pictures and changed the sign on the facade. Now above the door, it read Bean and Soul Community Space. There, he would offer workshops, courses, and job opportunities for women who, like Samantha, had been victims of abuse or injustice in the workplace. "I want this to be a safe place, where they are seen and respected," he said to the architect. While personally supervising every detail of the renovation, he didn't want any public credit, no formal inauguration. He simply let the space be opened, welcoming, transformative. One morning, standing at the freshly painted door, he took a deep breath, looking inside at the cafe, now bright and full of life again. He whispered to himself, "For you, Sam, always, for you." And as the first women crossed the door with renewed hope in their eyes, Alexander knew that this was the greatest proof of love he could give, to transform her pain, and that of so many others, into strength and opportunity. But even so, one question still haunted him. Would she know what he had done? Or would she never find out? And more than that, would she one day forgive him? Days after the opening of the space, Samantha received an elegant invitation, personally delivered by one of the new coordinators of Bean and Soul. The envelope was simple: But the invitation, carefully handwritten, said, "You are a special guest for the reopening of the Bean and Soul community space, a place where new stories begin." Samantha stood still with the paper between her fingers, her heart racing without quite understanding why. She had no idea who had organized it, nor could she imagine what awaited her. On the afternoon of the reopening, she wore a light, floral dress, simple like her, and walked to the place that had once been the stage of so much pain and humiliation. She walked along the sidewalks she knew so well, but that now seemed different, as if time had transformed everything around her. When she stopped in front of the cafe, she held her breath. The old red awning had been replaced with a new, elegant one, and the windows now displayed photos of women smiling, working, teaching. There were fresh flowers in the planters, and from inside came the cheerful sound of live music, and voices mingled in enthusiastic conversations. Samantha crossed the door with hesitant steps, feeling like a stranger in a place she had known so well not long ago. But what surprised her most was seeing so many people gathered there, women, children, entire families filling that space with life and hope. The coordinator who had delivered the invitation greeted her with a warm smile. "Welcome, Samantha. We've been waiting for you," she frowned, confused. "Waiting for me?" Before she could ask more, the sound of a microphone turning on filled the room. Samantha turned, following everyone's gaze, and then she saw him. On the small stage set up at the back of the cafe, next to the old counter, where she had so often prepared coffees, stood Alexander, holding the microphone with one hand and looking at her with an emotional gaze fixed solely on her. Samantha froze, her heart pounding, unable to even breathe. Alexander took a deep breath and began, his voice firm but filled with emotion. This place was the scene of difficult stories, of injustices, but also of courage and transformation. And today, it is reborn. Thanks to the inspiration of a woman who taught me the value of sincere love, and who gave me the hug that changed my life. The words echoed through the cafe, filling the atmosphere with a moving silence. Everyone applauded, but Samantha remained motionless, her eyes brimming with tears, her chest tight from a mix of disbelief and relief. Alexander placed the microphone on the stool and stepped down from the stage, walking toward her slowly, with his eyes fixed on hers, completely ignoring the dozens of people around them. Samantha took a step back, as if still resisting the idea that this was real. But Alexander stopped right in front of her, held her face with both hands and whispered so softly that only she could hear, "For you, I changed everything." Samantha, unable to hold back, let the tears fall, and with a sob caught in her throat murmured, "I just wanted it to be real." Alexander then smiled, with that same look she knew so well, and replied firmly as he gently wiped away a tear from her cheek with his thumb. It always was. Unable to resist any longer, she threw herself into his arms, hugging him tightly, as someone clinging to the only certainty they have. He held her close, and in that instant, the world around them disappeared. The cafe erupted in applause as they kissed there in the middle of everyone, with the intensity of those who had lived months suffocated by longing, regret, and absence, but who now finally had found each other again. Samantha sobbed softly, hidden in his chest, while Alexander stroked her hair, whispering, "I love you." She lifted her face, her eyes still tearful, and replied with a trembling smile, "I love you too." And as they embraced once more, amid the applause and smiles of strangers, Samantha realized that this was indeed a new beginning, a restart built not on lies, but on the simplest and most powerful truth of all: love. Months had passed since the reunion at Bean and Soul. That space, which once carried the silent marks of pain, now overflowed with life and hope. Samantha walked between the tables, checking the morning details. She had become the new manager of the space, coordinating workshops, welcoming women, and inspiring young women who, like she once did, thought they had no voice or power over their own stories. She wore a simple cotton dress with a blue apron. Over it, her hair tied in a ponytail and her eyes illuminated, not by pain anymore, but by the serenity of someone who at last had found a place and a love where she could be whole. Alexander entered the cafe every day through the back door, no longer as an owner or businessman, but as a life partner, someone who swapped leather shoes for worn-out sneakers and helped carry boxes, arrange shelves, and prepare coffee for the community events. Sitting at one of the tables near the window, he read a book while watching her walk by, with that same silent smile he'd carried since their first hug at the airport. Samantha noticed the look and, pretending to be annoyed, pointed at him. "Are you going to help me or just keep admiring me from a distance?" Alexander laughed and set the book down on the table. He stood up, walked over to her, and wrapped his arms around her waist, gently pulling her into a tight hug. "I never get tired of looking at you," he whispered, his voice deep and warm. She smiled and rested her head on his chest, listening to the heartbeat that months ago she had almost believed she would never hear again. "You've changed so much," she said, running her hands over the collar of his shirt, now always open, without those suffocating ties. Alexander kissed her forehead softly and replied, "You taught me what really matters." After that reunion, he decided to drastically reduce his involvement in business. He started delegating most of the operations of Morgan Hotels, and for the first time in years, began living without the constant weight of contracts and figures. "I don't want my life to be just about assets," he had told her one night, as they walked along the park trail where they'd had their first kiss. "I want it to be about who I am, and who I can become by your side." Samantha, moved, held his hand tightly and responded, "And who you are is so much more than the name you carry." Now, in the eyes of everyone, they were just an ordinary couple from Atlanta, but between them, they knew. They had lived a love story that overcame fears, masks, and prejudices. It wasn't a perfect life. It had the challenges of any relationship, the usual fears and uncertainties about the future. But there was a conscious choice there, every day, to give themselves to each other with respect and courage. On a Saturday afternoon, after another workshop for women, Samantha closed the doors of Bean and Soul and sat next to Alexander on the wooden bench at the small deck at the back of the cafe, where they could watch the sunset, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. She rested her head on his shoulder and stayed silent for a few minutes, just listening to the sound of birds and feeling the soft breeze. Alexander broke the silence. "Did you realize how it all started? With a mistaken hug?" Samantha chuckled quietly, remembering the day at the airport, the confusion, the embarrassment, and how that mistake had, in truth, been the best decision of their lives. "Sometimes, the best encounters are the ones we don't plan," she replied, intertwining her fingers with his. He looked at her with that same look of admiration as always, and added, "And love doesn't choose based on who you are, but on who you become beside the right person." Samantha smiled, her eyes sparkling, and sealed the phrase with a soft kiss full of complicity. There, in that simple moment, they finally understood that true love doesn't depend on status, money, or appearances, but on giving, on respect, on courage, and above all, on choosing every day to be the best version of yourself for the other. So, what did you think of this story? I'd really love to know your opinion. Leave your rating from 0 to 10 in the comments, telling me how much it moved you. If you liked it, give the video a thumbs up, share it with someone who loves touching stories like this, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any of the next ones. Before you go, I've prepared another emotional story that will surely touch your heart even more. Don't miss it.